What if I told you that one man, a single individual, could own a country, not rule it as a monarch, not govern it as a president, but own it, in the same way you might own a house or a car, an entire nation sprawling over 2 million square kilometers, with a population of 20 million souls, all listed as personal assets on his private ledger. Imagine a map of Africa and a vast green heart, larger than England, France, Germany, Spain, and Italy combined, belonging not to its people, not even to a colonizing nation, but to the king of another country, thousands of miles away, as his personal fiefdom, his private slaughterhouse. This isn't a dystopian fantasy. This was a terrifying reality at the turn of the 20th century. This was the Congo Free State, the personal property of King Leopold II of Belgium, and the story of his ownership is written not in ink, but in blood, and accounted for not in cash, but in severed human hands. When you hear the term atrocity, your mind likely conjures images of frenzied, hate-filled soldiers, of death camps born from a rabid ideology. But the architect of this particular Holocaust never once set foot in his blood-soaked dominion. He was a celebrated figure in Europe, a philanthropist, a visionary, the builder king who beautified Brussels with magnificent parks and avenues. He was a doting father, a man of sophistication and charm. Yet, this same man presided over a system of terror so profound, so methodical in its cruelty, that it halved the population of his private country in just 2 decades. A democide that claimed up to 13 million lives. This isn't a story of passionate hatred. It is a story of something far colder, far more modern, and perhaps far more terrifying, the banal, bureaucratic, and industrial-scale evil of unchecked corporate greed, personified in a single, crowned head. Forget what you think you know about colonialism. This was something different, something purer in its malevolence. This wasn't a nation subjugating another for glory or settlement. This was a hostile corporate takeover of a country, executed with military force. The state was a company. The army was its security force, and the people were not citizens, but unpaid, enslaved assets to be worked to death. The primary export of the Congo Free State wasn't just ivory or rubber. It was human misery on a scale that defies comprehension. So, prepare yourself. We are about to pull back the velvet curtain of European high society to reveal the charnel house it was built upon. We will journey into the heart of a darkness orchestrated by one man's ambition. How did this happen? And more importantly, could it happen again? Our story begins not in the sweltering humidity of the Congo Basin, but in the stale, cigar-scented air of the Berlin Conference in 1884. Here, the great powers of Europe gathered like vultures around a map, their pencils and rulers carving up a continent as if it were a cake. And at the center of it all, weaving his web of deceit, was King Leopold II. He was a monarch with a grand inferiority complex. Belgium was small, a geopolitical afterthought wedged between the titans of France and Germany. Leopold yearned for more. He craved the prestige, the power, and above all, the wealth of an empire. "There are no small countries," he famously said, "only small minds." He had tried to buy colonies from Spain and Argentina, but failed. So, he turned his gaze to the vast, uncolonized heart of Africa, the Congo Basin, a territory 80 times the size of Belgium itself. He knew he could not conquer it militarily or claim it for his small nation outright. The other powers would never allow it. So, he devised a ruse of breathtaking audacity. He didn't present himself as a conqueror, but as a philanthropist. He created front organizations with lofty, benevolent names: the International African Association, the Committee for Studies of the Upper Congo. He hosted grand anti-slavery conferences in Brussels, weeping crocodile tears for the plight of the African people at the hands of Arab slave traders. He promised to bring the 3 C's to the Congo commerce: Christianity and civilization. He declared his sole intention was to create a free trade zone, a beacon of progress and enlightenment that would benefit all of humanity, and most especially its native inhabitants. He was a master of public relations, a pioneer of the corporate lie. The world's leaders, from the United States to the German Chancellor Otto von Bismarck, bought it completely. They were blinded by their own racist assumptions that Africans were incapable of self-governance and needed a benevolent European hand. They saw in Leopold a convenient solution, a man willing to bear the financial and administrative burden of civilizing this wild land. And so, in an act of staggering geopolitical negligence, they handed the key to the Congo, not to the Belgian state, but to Leopold's private association, which was, in reality, just Leopold himself. The Berlin Act of 1885 officially recognized the Congo Free State. The first word was a lie. The second was a cruel joke. The fox had just been handed the keys to the henhouse, a henhouse containing 20 million living souls. With the world's blessing, Leopold's personal, genocidal enterprise was born. The ink was barely dry on the treaty before the mask began to slip, and the true purpose of his venture plunder on an unimaginable scale was set into motion. Let us leave the gilded halls of Europe and journey into the world Leopold had just acquired. Imagine you are a man named Nsala, living in a village along the banks of a tributary of the Great Congo River. Your life is governed by the seasons, by the planting of cassava, by the wisdom of your elders. Your world is rich with tradition, family, and a deep connection to the forest that provides everything. One day, a steamboat, a monstrous, smoke-belching creature, churns its way up your river. White men in starched uniforms step off, followed by black men in blue uniforms with brass buttons, carrying rifles. These are the officers of the Force Publique, Leopold's private army. At first, they speak of trade. They want ivory. But soon, the demand changes. A man in America has invented the inflatable tire, and across the world, a new industrial hunger is born, a hunger for rubber. The forests of your home are filled with wild rubber vines, Landolphia owariensis. The white men, station agents of the Anglo-Belgian India Rubber Company, or ABIR, now demand rubber. They don't offer to buy it. They demand it as a tax. Every man in your village is given a quota that is impossibly high. To get the rubber, you must venture deep into the forest, for days on end. You must slash the thick vines with a knife and smear the sticky, white latex all over your body. It is painful to scrape off, often taking skin and hair with it. You work from dawn until dusk, driven by a gnawing fear, because failure to meet the quota is not an option. If your village comes up short, the Force Publique arrives. They do not reason or negotiate. They seize the women and children. Your wife, your sons, your daughters are herded into a crude wooden stockade, open to the relentless sun and the chilling rain. They are given barely enough food to survive. They are hostages. They will remain there, starving, sick, and terrified, until you and the other men of the village deliver the full quota of rubber. The sounds from that stockade, the cries of hungry children, The wails of desperate mothers become the soundtrack to your life. Your home is no longer a place of community. It is a forced labor camp. The forest is no longer a provider. It is a green hell. And every ounce of rubber you collect is paid for with the slow-burning terror of your family's potential starvation. This was the system, replicated in thousands of villages across the vastness of the Congo. It was a perfect, self-sustaining engine of horror. The system needed more than just fear. It needed a brutal form of accounting. The bullets for the Force Publique's modern rifles were expensive. Leopold's agents in the field had to prove that every cartridge fired was used not for hunting, but for punishing or killing a rebellious native. The proof they demanded was the victim's right hand. A soldier would go into the forest, fire his weapon, and return with a severed hand to show his white officer that the bullet was not wasted. This practice soon spiraled into a grotesque currency of its own. If a soldier missed his shot or used a bullet to hunt for food, he would simply find a living person, a man, a woman, a child, and cut off their hand to account for the spent cartridge. Villages that tried to fight back were met with extermination. The Force Publique, often composed of conscripts from other regions of Africa or even cannibal tribes deliberately employed for their ferocity, would descend on a village, kill everyone, burn it to the ground, and return to their post with baskets woven from palm fronds, overflowing with the severed hands of the dead. These baskets were presented to the white station chiefs as proof of a mission accomplished. The agents recorded the number of hands in their journals as if they were logging shipments of goods. This was red rubber, a term that came to define the era rubber harvested and stained with the blood of millions. But such monumental evil cannot remain hidden forever. Cracks of light began to pierce the darkness. An African-American historian and Civil War veteran named George Washington Williams traveled to the Congo in 1890 expecting to see the benevolent enterprise Leopold had advertised. He was met with a waking nightmare. He wrote a searing, open letter directly to King Leopold, detailing the crimes against humanity he had witnessed: the brutal soldiers, the stolen land, the broken treaties, the sheer horror of the regime. He was the first great whistleblower. Then came E.D. Morel, a humble, meticulous shipping clerk in Liverpool for the Elder Dempster Company, which held the shipping contract with the Congo Free State. Morel noticed a strange discrepancy in the cargo manifests. He saw ships arriving from the Congo laden with fortunes in rubber and ivory, but he saw the ships sailing to the Congo carrying almost nothing of value for trade. They carried soldiers, officers, rifles, ammunition, and cannon. Morel, a man of simple accounting, made a brilliant deduction if nothing was being traded in return. This was not trade. This was slavery. It was the only possible explanation. Horrified, Morel quit his job and dedicated his life to exposing Leopold. He founded the Congo Reform Association, a powerful humanitarian movement. He was joined by Roger Casement, the British consul to the Congo. Casement undertook a long, perilous journey deep into the interior in 1903. His official government document, the Casement Report, was filled with harrowing, first-hand testimonies from victims. It detailed the hostage houses, the floggings with the shikot, a whip of hippopotamus hide, and most damningly, the severed hands. The combined efforts of Morel, Casement, and other brave individuals, including the writer Mark Twain, who penned the brilliant satire King Leopold's Soliloquy, slowly began to turn the tide of public opinion. The world, which had so eagerly sanctioned this horror, was finally being forced to look at what it had created. If you were Nsala, trapped in this impossible system, watching your family starve and your people mutilated. What would you do? Would you submit, working yourself to death in the faint hope of saving your loved ones? Would you attempt to flee into the jungle, knowing the soldiers would hunt you down? Or would you lead a rebellion, a suicidal last stand for dignity against an overwhelmingly powerful foe? There is no right answer. Comment your impossible choice below. The central, agonizing question of this entire saga is why? Why did this happen? It is easy to label King Leopold II a monster, a sadist, a figure of pure evil, and in many ways, he was. But to simply dismiss him as a one-dimensional villain is to miss the more profound and disturbing lesson of his reign of terror. The horror of the Congo Free State was not born from the kind of fanatical, ideological hatred that fueled other genocides of the 20th century. Leopold did not order the deaths of millions of Congolese people because he subscribed to a detailed philosophy of their racial inferiority. Though that belief was certainly a convenient and necessary underpinning, he did not kill them for a twisted vision of a pure-blooded future or for the glory of a god. The motivation was far more common, far more relatable, and therefore far more chilling. It was about money. It was about status. It was pure, unadulterated, psychopathic greed. The Congo Holocaust was a crime of arithmetic. The Congolese people were not the targets of an extermination campaign. They were simply entries on a balance sheet. Their lives, their limbs, their suffering were calculated as the acceptable cost of doing business. They were human resources to be exploited until they broke, and then discarded. The severed hands were not trophies of a race war. They were a gruesome form of inventory control. This strips the evil of its epic, almost mythical quality and reveals it for what it was: a business plan. A business plan executed with the ruthlessness of a predator and the indifference of an accountant. Leopold saw a world of empires and felt inadequate. He looked at Queen Victoria's dominion over India, at France's holdings in Africa and Asia, and he wanted his own piece of the pie. The Congo was his startup, and he was its CEO. The product was rubber, and the labor costs had to be kept at zero. The contradiction is nauseating: a man speaking of enlightenment and Christian charity in the salons of Europe, while his agents ran a slave state based on torture and mutilation, all to fund the construction of opulent arches and museums back home. The conflict lies in the schism between public persona and private reality. In the late 19th century, the idea of progress was a powerful drug. The Industrial Revolution was reshaping the world, and science and exploration were seen as noble pursuits. Leopold masterfully wrapped his colonial ambitions in this language. He wasn't conquering a people, he claimed. He was ending the Arab slave trade. He wasn't exploiting a land. He was opening it to free trade. He wasn't establishing a tyranny. He was bringing civilization to the savages. This was the ultimate lie, a carefully constructed facade for the consumption of the Western world. The deep-seated racism of the era provided the fertile soil in which this lie could grow. The prevailing view in Europe and America was that Africans were a lesser people, childlike, lazy, and violent, incapable of governing themselves or developing their own resources. This dehumanizing belief was not a fringe opinion. It was mainstream scientific and social thought. It allowed Leopold's audience to believe his philanthropic claims because it fit their worldview. Of course, the natives would resist civilization. Of course, they needed a firm hand. Of course, force was necessary to make them productive. This narrative allowed millions of people in the West to feel good about a project that was, at its core, utterly depraved. So the contradiction wasn't just Leopold's, it was an entire generation's. It was the contradiction of a civilization that prided itself on reason, law, and Christian morality, while simultaneously sanctioning, through ignorance or indifference, the enslavement and slaughter of millions. Leopold was simply the most audacious and successful practitioner of this hypocrisy. He understood that if you told a big enough lie and wrapped it in the right moral packaging, the world would not only believe you, but they would thank you for it. He turned a genocide into a humanitarian mission, a masterstroke of cynical public relations. Let's crystallize the problem. The Congo Free State was founded on a fundamental, irreconcilable conflict between its stated mission and its actual function, its charter. Blessed by the world's powers, spoke of protecting natives, suppressing slavery, and encouraging free trade. Its actual function, dictated by Leopold's private decrees, was to extract the maximum amount of wealth in the shortest possible time, using any means necessary. The state was not a state in any recognizable sense. It had no duty to its people. It provided no education, no health care, no infrastructure that did not directly serve the purpose of resource extraction. The roads and rails it built were designed only to get rubber and ivory from the interior to the sea. The laws it passed were not for justice, but for control. The law, for instance, that declared all vacant land to be the property of the state was a legal fiction that dispossessed the entire population of their ancestral homes and hunting grounds, turning them into squatters in their own country. This legal maneuver was the foundation of the entire system. By making the land and its resources his own, Leopold could legally define any Congolese person taking food from the forest or failing to work for him as a thief or a rebel, thereby justifying any level of violence against them. This created a perfect totalitarian system, a closed loop of exploitation. The Congolese were trapped. They were denied their land, forced to work for free under the threat of torture and death, and legally defined as criminals if they resisted. The very entity that claimed to be their protector became their enslaver, their judge, and their executioner. The problem was not just a cruel man. It was the creation of a perfect, hermetically sealed system of oppression, where law, commerce, and military force were all bent to a single, rapacious will. It was the ultimate perversion of the concept of a state. To understand how thousands of agents and soldiers could carry out such unspeakable acts, we must turn to psychology. We see a powerful illustration of what psychologist Philip Zimbardo termed the Lucifer effect, the process by which good or ordinary people can be seduced, recruited, or initiated into committing evil acts. The white station agents in the Congo were often unremarkable young men from Belgium, seeking adventure or fortune. The black soldiers of the Force Publique were often conscripts, brutalized into submission themselves. They were not all psychopaths to begin with. The system made them into monsters. This transformation was enabled by several key psychological mechanisms. First, dehumanization. Through relentless propaganda and the casual racism of the era, the Congolese people were stripped of their humanity in the eyes of their tormentors. They were referred to as lazy, savage, monkeys. Once a group is labeled as less than human, the moral prohibitions against harming them are eroded. It becomes easier to flog a brute than a man, easier to murder a savage than a father. Second, the diffusion of responsibility. A station agent in a remote outpost could tell himself he was just following orders from the district commissioner. The commissioner was following orders from the governor-general in Boma. The governor-general was following the profit-driven decrees of King Leopold in Brussels. Leopold, in turn, could distance himself entirely, claiming he was unaware of the regrettable excesses of his men on the ground. In this long chain of command, no single individual felt the full weight of moral responsibility for the pile of severed hands. Everyone was just doing their job. This is what political theorist Hannah Arendt, observing the trial of a Nazi officer, famously called the banality of evil. It's evil committed by cogs in a machine, not by frothing at the mouth monsters. Finally, there was the immense pressure of the quota system. It created a brutal, competitive environment where an agent's success, promotion, and even safety depended on how much rubber he could extract. This intense situational pressure overrode individual morality. They were trapped in an evil system that rewarded cruelty and punished compassion. They adapted, and in adapting, they became unrecognizable. From a sociological and economic perspective, the Congo Free State was not a state at all. It was a predator state, or more accurately, a predator corporation masquerading as a state. A legitimate state, in theory, enters into a social contract with its people. The people surrender some individual freedoms and pay taxes, and in return, the state provides security, justice, and public services. Leopold's Congo did the exact opposite. It offered no services, no justice, and no security. It only took. Its sole function was to transfer the wealth of the land, its resources, and the labor of its people into the pockets of one man. This model is the purest, most extreme form of extractive colonialism. Most colonial powers, like Britain and India, had a complex set of motives that included trade, settlement, geopolitical strategy, and an often hypocritical sense of a civilizing mission. They built some infrastructure and institutions. However self-serving, Leopold's Congo stripped away all these pretenses. There was no social contract, only a commercial one between Leopold and his concessionary companies. The people of the Congo were not party to this contract. They were the raw material it consumed. We can analyze this using world systems theory, which posits a global economic system where core nations like Belgium exploit periphery nations like the Congo for cheap labor and raw materials. The Congo Free State is the ultimate example of a periphery region being ruthlessly integrated into the global capitalist economy. The invention of the pneumatic tire in the core created a demand that was met by instituting a system of slave labor in the periphery. The profits flowed in one direction, only from the periphery to the core, specifically to Leopold himself. He used this wealth to beautify Brussels, creating the Cinquantenaire Park and Arch, the royal greenhouses of Lecken, and funding other public works. The magnificent avenues of the Belgian capital were, quite literally, paved with the blood and suffering of the Congo. This is the stark reality of uneven development. The development of one place is predicated on the violent underdevelopment of another. The effectiveness of Leopold's brutal regime was also magnified by a massive technological imbalance. The societies of the Congo Basin were diverse and complex, but they were largely pre-industrial. Leopold's force publique was armed with the cutting edge of late 19th century military technology. Most crucial was the steamboat. The Congo River and its tributaries form a massive network of natural highways. Without the steamboat, the vast interior of the basin would have been largely inaccessible. These vessels allowed Leopold's agents to project power deep into the jungle with unprecedented speed and efficiency. A village that was days or weeks away by canoe could be reached in a fraction of the time by a steamboat carrying dozens of soldiers. It was the logistics backbone of the entire terror operation. Then there were the weapons. The force publique was armed with modern, breech-loading rifles like the Albini Brendlin and later, the Mauser. These rifles were accurate, reliable, and had a high rate of fire compared to the muskets or traditional weapons available to the Congolese. A small number of soldiers could suppress or annihilate a much larger force of villagers armed with spears, bows, and arrows. The Maxim gun, the first true machine gun, also made appearances, capable of mowing down any resistance with terrifying efficiency. This technological gap meant that rebellion was almost always suicidal. It created a climate of learned helplessness. The steamboat became a symbol of impending doom, its whistle a sound of terror. The rifle became the ultimate arbiter of power. This wasn't just a military advantage. It was a psychological one. It fostered a sense of overwhelming powerlessness among the Congolese people, making the system of forced labor and terror much easier to maintain. The entire enterprise was, in a sense, a triumph of technology not for progress, but for oppression. The tools of the Industrial Revolution were turned into instruments of mass enslavement. When we place Leopold's Congo alongside other great historical atrocities, a chilling distinction emerges. The Holocaust, for example, was driven by a fervent, meticulously documented, and fanatical ideology of racial purification. The Nazis were obsessed with Jewish identity. Their goal was the physical extermination of a people based on a pseudo-scientific theory of race. The Armenian genocide was fueled by a toxic brew of Turkish nationalism and religious persecution. The Rwandan genocide was the horrifying explosion of decades of cultivated ethnic hatred between Hutu and Tutsi. These were crimes of passionate, focused, ideological hate. The Congo Holocaust was different. It was a genocide of indifference. King Leopold II likely did not spend his days consumed by a burning, personal hatred for the Congolese people. He probably didn't think about them at all, except as figures on a ledger. They were not the object of his passion. They were an obstacle to it. His passion was for wealth, for status, for building a grander Belgium and a fatter personal bank account. The Congolese people were simply a resource, like the rubber vines in the forest. You tap a vine until it runs dry. You work a laborer until they collapse. If the process of extraction involves terror, mutilation, and death, then so be it. It is an unfortunate but necessary operational cost. This raises a deeply unsettling philosophical question: which evil is worse? The evil that passionately hates its victim, that sees them as a demonic, existential threat, or the evil that does not see its victim as a person at all, but as an inanimate object to be used and discarded. The first is a firestorm of hatred. The second is the chilling, silent cold of the void. There is a terrifying intimacy to ideological genocide. The perpetrator is obsessed with the victim. Leopold's genocide was the opposite. It was the ultimate act of depersonalization. The lives of millions were extinguished, not with a furious scream, but with the quiet scratch of a pen in a ledger book in a palace thousands of miles away. It was a holocaust by proxy, a murder committed with the clean hands of an accountant. The Congo Free State was more than just a crime scene. It was a perfect political science experiment. It was a real-world test of Lord Acton's famous aphorism, "Power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely." In Belgium, Leopold was a constitutional monarch. He had a parliament to answer to, laws to obey, a press to scrutinize his actions. He was constrained. But in the Congo, all those constraints vanished. He was not a king. He was a god-emperor. He was the executive, the legislature, and the judiciary all rolled into one. The laws were his decrees. The land was his property. The people were his subjects in the most feudal sense of the word. There was no constitution, no independent courts, no free press, no opposition parties. It was a perfect laboratory for unchecked tyranny. And the results of the experiment were conclusive. When a single human being is given total, unaccountable power over millions, backed by modern military technology and driven by an insatiable lust for profit, the result is not enlightenment and progress. The result is a human abattoir. The system Leopold created selected for the worst aspects of human nature. It rewarded cruelty, punished empathy, and elevated greed to the level of a cardinal virtue. The men who thrived in the Congo Free State were the most ruthless, the most brutal, the most willing to leave their humanity behind. This challenges the great man theory of history, which posits that history is shaped by the will of extraordinary individuals. Leopold was certainly an extraordinary individual, extraordinarily cunning, ambitious, and ruthless. But his story also shows the immense power of systems. He created a system where atrocities were not just possible, but inevitable. The horror was not an aberration of the system. It was the system, functioning as designed. It teaches us that the greatest danger is not necessarily the evil man, but the creation of an evil system that can harness the ordinary frailties of many men, their greed, their fear, their capacity for obedience, and channel them into a torrent of unimaginable suffering. The question, then, is not just about the darkness in one man's heart, but about how we build societies that place permanent, unbreakable checks on such power, to ensure no such laboratory can ever be created again. One of the most profound and uncomfortable aspects of this history is the complicity of the wider world. Leopold's grand deception at the Berlin Conference was possible only because the great powers wanted to be deceived. They had their own colonial ambitions, their own racist ideologies. Accepting Leopold's humanitarian project was a convenient way to settle the Congo question without starting a war among themselves. It was a collective act of willful blindness. For nearly 2 decades, as the horror unfolded, the world remained largely silent. Why part of the answer lies in Leopold's masterful control of information. He was a pioneer of corporate lobbying and propaganda. He paid newspapers to publish glowing stories about his work. He hired prominent lawyers and politicians to sing his praises. He brought dignitaries to curated model villages that were nothing like the reality. He controlled the narrative with an iron fist. But another part of the answer is more troubling. It's the simple human tendency to ignore distant suffering, especially when confronting it would be uncomfortable or costly. The horrors of the Congo were an inconvenient truth. To acknowledge them would be to acknowledge the deep hypocrisy at the heart of the European civilizing mission. It would force nations to question their own colonial projects. And so, for years, the reports that trickled out were dismissed as missionary hysteria or the grumblings of disgruntled traders. It took the relentless, courageous work of a handful of individuals like E. D. Morel and Roger Casement to shatter this conspiracy of silence. They did not just expose a king. They exposed the moral apathy of an entire generation. Their crusade forces us to ask what horrors are happening in the world, right now that we are choosing to ignore. What inconvenient truths are we dismissing because they challenge our comfort and our worldview? The silence that allowed the Congo to bleed for 20 years is not a historical artifact. It is a recurring human temptation, a moral failing that we must constantly fight against. In our own time as much as in Leopold's, the story of the Congo Free State did not end in 1908, when King Leopold II, under immense international pressure, was forced to sell his private colony to the Belgian state. The name changed to the Belgian Congo, but the system of exploitation, while less overtly murderous, continued. The legacy of Leopold's reign is not a historical footnote. It is a deep, festering wound that continues to bleed into the present day. The Democratic Republic of Congo, as it is now known, is one of the poorest and most conflict-ridden nations on Earth, despite being arguably the richest in terms of natural resources. This is not a coincidence. It is a direct consequence of its history. Leopold's regime systematically destroyed indigenous social structures, political institutions, and economies. It replaced self-sufficient farming with forced labor, creating a dependency that has never been broken. It governed not by building a nation, but by pitting ethnic groups against each other. A classic divide-and-rule tactic whose poisonous fruits are still being harvested in regional conflicts today. When Belgium finally granted independence in 1960, it left behind a hollowed-out shell, a vast country with virtually no university graduates, a handful of doctors, and no experience in self-governance. Into this vacuum stepped a new generation of predators. The Cold War turned the Congo into a proxy battlefield, with the CIA orchestrating the assassination of its first democratically elected prime minister, Patrice Lumumba, and installing the kleptocratic dictator Mobutu Sese Seko. Mobutu ruled for over 30 years, looting the country's wealth on a scale that would have made Leopold proud, all with the full backing of the West. After Mobutu, the country collapsed into a series of devastating wars, often called Africa's World War, which have killed over 5 million people since the late 1990s. These wars have been, and still are, fueled by the scramble to control the Congo's immense mineral wealth, not rubber this time, but diamonds, gold, and most crucially for our modern world, coltan and cobalt. The parallel between Leopold's red rubber and the blood minerals of today is terrifyingly precise. Cobalt is an essential component in the lithium-ion batteries that power your smartphone, your laptop, your electric car. Over 70% of the world's cobalt comes from the DRC. Much of it is mined in horrific conditions by artisanal miners, including children, who work with their bare hands in unstable, hand-dug tunnels for $1 or $2 a day. These mines are often controlled by armed militias or corrupt officials who, just like Leopold's agents, use violence and intimidation to control the resource trade. The supply chain is long and deliberately opaque. The cobalt is bought by local traders, sold to larger purchasing houses, processed in China, and then sold to the world's largest electronics and automotive companies. Each step in the chain adds a layer of deniability. The multinational corporation can claim, just as Leopold did, that they are unaware of the regrettable excesses happening at the source. They can point to corporate social responsibility policies and supplier codes of conduct, just as Leopold pointed to his anti-slavery conference declarations. But the fundamental logic is identical. The comfort and technological advancement of the developed world are being subsidized by the brutal exploitation of the Congolese people and their land. The severed hand has been replaced by the collapsed tunnel. The Chicotte has been replaced by the Kalashnikov. But the core dynamic of a distant, wealthy consumer benefiting from a violent, extractive system they do not see remains unchanged. When you hold your sleek, modern smartphone, you are holding a device whose existence is linked, down a long and bloody chain, to the very same historical wound that Leopold carved into the heart of Africa. The ghost of the Congo Free State is in your pocket. It's a deeply uncomfortable thought, but one we must confront if we are to truly understand the modern relevance of this history. The system of exploitation has not vanished. It has simply become more sophisticated, more globalized, and better at hiding its victims from our view. Perhaps the most insidious legacy of Leopold's crime is the fight over its memory. For decades, this history was deliberately suppressed. In Belgium, Leopold was, and in many places still is, celebrated as the Builder King, the Great Modernizer. The Royal Museum for Central Africa in Tervuren, originally built by Leopold to showcase his civilizing mission, for a century presented a sanitized, paternalistic, and deeply racist vision of the colonial past. The millions dead, the severed hands, the reign of terror, all were erased from the official narrative. Statues of Leopold still stand in Belgian cities, a testament to a profound national amnesia. In recent years, a powerful movement of activists, historians, and artists, particularly from the Congolese diaspora, has fought to tear down this wall of silence. They have demanded the removal of statues, the renaming of streets, and a fundamental reckoning with Belgium's colonial past. This struggle is not just about history, it's about the present. How can a society address the systemic racism and inequality that exist today if it refuses to acknowledge the historical crimes from which they grew? This battle for memory in Belgium is a microcosm of a global conversation. From the removal of Confederate statues in the United States to the Rhodes Must Fall movement in Britain and South Africa, societies around the world are being forced to confront the dark chapters of their past. It is a painful and contentious process because it challenges national identity and comfortable myths. It forces people to see their heroes as villains, their progress as plunder, and their wealth as ill-gotten. But this reckoning is essential. To forget a genocide is to commit a second crime. To silence the victims is to grant a posthumous victory to the perpetrators. The fight to remember the Congo Free State is a fight for the soul of history itself, a declaration that no crime is so great, and no king so powerful, that it can be erased from the human story. The story of King Leopold II and the Congo Free State serves as a timeless and terrifying warning. It is a testament to the depths of human cruelty, not in the heat of passion, but in the cold, rational pursuit of profit. It reveals how a veneer of civilization, philanthropy, and progress can be used to mask the most barbaric of enterprises. We saw how one man's unchecked ambition, amplified by the technologies of his age and enabled by the world's indifference, created a machine of suffering on a continental scale. He took one of the most vibrant and resource-rich regions on the planet and turned it into a graveyard, a human experiment in absolute power that yielded the most horrific of results. Leopold died peacefully in his bed in 1909, one of the richest men in the world, never having faced justice for his crimes. The fortune he plundered from the Congo was absorbed into the Belgian state and his own estate. There were no trials, no reparations, no formal apologies for decades. For the millions who perished, the men worked to death in the forest, the women and children who starved in the stockades, the countless victims of the rifle and the shikot, the children whose hands were severed, there was only silence. Theirs is a holocaust that has been largely forgotten, a chapter of history deliberately torn from the book. But his story forces us to look beyond the man and at the system he perfected. We rightly condemn Leopold as a monster. But was he the disease, Or was he merely its most virulent and successful symptom? The sickness is the belief that some lives are worth less than others. The sickness is the idea that profit can be placed above people. The sickness is the seductive power of greed, a force that can persuade ordinary men to commit extraordinary evil and convince the world to look the other way. This pathology did not die with Leopold. It lives on in the sweatshops where workers toil in unsafe conditions for poverty wages to make our fast fashion. It lives on in the forests that are illegally clear-cut, displacing indigenous communities to produce our palm oil and beef. It lives on in the murky supply chains that hide the child labor and conflict minerals in our electronics. The names have changed. The commodities are different, and the methods are more subtle. But the fundamental equation of immense profit for a few, built upon the hidden suffering of many, remains a constant and shameful feature of our globalized world. Leopold's ghost is a reminder of the worst-case scenario, of what happens when this logic is taken to its absolute extreme. The history of the Congo Free State is not just about the past. It is a moral lesson for the present and a dire warning for the future. It teaches us that we must be eternally vigilant against the concentration of unaccountable power. It teaches us to be skeptical of lofty rhetoric that masks commercial interests. And most of all, it teaches us that silence is complicity. The world's greatest defense against a future Leopold is not a treaty or a law, but a conscious, informed, and empathetic global citizenry that refuses to look away. We must be the whistleblowers. We must be the E.D. Morels and Roger Casements of our time. We must be the ones who check the ledgers, who question the cargo, and who demand to know the true cost of the products we consume. The story of the Congo has been silenced for far too long. Its victims deserve to be remembered, and its lessons deserve to be learned. If you believe that these hidden pasts must be brought into the light, please like this video. Subscribe to The Hidden Past for more deep dives into the shadows of history, and share this story so that the millions of victims of the Congo Free State are never forgotten. What other historical figures or events with a dark, hidden side do you think the world needs to re-examine? Let us know in the comments below. The past is never dead. It's not even past.